Good morning, afternoon, evening, and welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents, a new offering on Village TV. Concerned Citizens of Laguna Woods is an organization committed to peace, social justice, economic equality, and a clean environment. For the duration of the lockdown, instead of its usual 2 meetings a month, Concerned Citizens will broadcast 2 programs a month on this channel. Our programs will feature films, lectures, and debates on topics related to our mission. We hope you enjoy today's program.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concerned Citizens Presents. Today, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Daniel Stokels from the University of California at Irvine. He is an interesting person and I think an ideal person to speak to today's topic, which is how people react to and deal with stress of a pandemic. He was the founding dean of the School of Social Ecology at UCI. He is at present the Chancellor's Professor Emeritus, and he has appointments not only in the School of Social Ecology, but in the School of Public Health. His training is in research psychology, but he branched out into this new field and is one of the founders of it in this country. Maybe he'll tell us a little bit more about what social ecology is. Welcome, Dr. Stokels.
Thank you very much, Joel. Appreciate being here. So yeah, I think just a little bit about myself, as Joel was saying, was trained in social psychology, but I had interests in environmental psychology, how people react to the physical and the social environment. And over time developed interests in more broadly how societal conditions as well as people's immediate surroundings affect them. So as a social ecologist, I tend to look at people's reactions to their surroundings in terms of different levels that have influence on them. We have our immediate environments, our home and family settings. Our kids go to school, they have their classroom settings, daycare and the like. And then more broadly in society, there are a variety of community places that we frequent, certainly in pre-pandemic times. And what's going on more broadly in society affects us in terms of political turmoil, in terms of climate change, people's concerns about that, as well as the pandemic, COVID-19. So I tend to view people's reactions to COVID in the context of their everyday life settings, their typical activity routines, from the local to the more global. And when we talk about how people react to COVID, there's certainly the stresses and strains of worrying about the health threats associated with the pandemic, the kind of isolation where we're precluded from going out to the kinds of everyday settings, restaurants, movie theaters, things like that we were used to before. And that confinement is somewhat indeterminate. We don't know how long this is going to go on. So certainly worries and anxiety about COVID are very natural and understandable. But when you combine the pandemic with other things going on in our society, such as the political polarization and chaos in our country right now, concerns about the election coming up in November, racism, the Black Lives Matter movement, violence in terms of gun violence and other types of violence in our country, as well as the looming issues of climate change and environmental pollution, all of that together is a very hefty mix of stressors. And so this is taking a toll on people's ability to sort of go about their daily routines in a kind of comfortable, non-worried way. I think it's quite natural that most of us are feeling some degree of anxiety and worries about the pandemic in the context of all these other things. So when I look at ways that people can cope with the pandemic, and especially in situations where some groups in the population are more vulnerable to COVID, older people in the population who perhaps feel even more confinement and in some cases more isolation and loneliness than younger groups who are out and about. I look at the kinds of resources they have at hand in their immediate local settings, their immediate home space, for example, the areas around their immediate home space, like the areas they go out and walk in, for example, their proximity to friends and relatives, and that can include virtual proximity as well as geographic proximity. So what are the kinds of resources that seem to help people cope with these enormous levels of stress that we're experiencing now? And one area, of course, is social support and social relationships. There's quite a lot of evidence in the fields of social psychology, social epidemiology, health psychology, that the more connected we are to meaningful relationships and ties, both in our immediate home and family environments, but also in terms of our friendship networks, our peer networks, our colleagues and coworkers, the more of those ties we have, the more resistant we are to premature death. And these are studies that have been prospective longitudinal studies over multiple years, and they find that when they measure people's levels of social connectedness and their subsequent mortality, social ties are kind of an insulating factor for us. So our dilemma now is that we're blocked from our normal access to many of our social ties. It's hard to go over to children's house or brothers and sisters' homes and hug each other and hang out together the way we used to. So people are relying more and more on Zoom connections and virtual FaceTime platforms and things like that to stay in touch. Excuse me. And, okay. In addition to having access to other people, there are ways in which we can reach out to others. So, in terms of helping others out or visiting each other virtually, checking on each other, I think that can be an extremely important action that helps us, it helps the support giver as much as it helps the people receiving support. And there's a lot of evidence that reaching out to others has that kind of effect. There are personal things we can do. We have our daily routines and keeping those going so we have a kind of sense of structure in our daily lives, which is very important. Whether that includes exercise routines, if we can get out and walk or be active. Some people do in-house exercise with virtual trainers that come in on FaceTime or Zoom. Trying to get enough sleep, eating a good healthy diet, those are all extremely valuable. To the extent that people own pets and they're able to care for another living being in their home, their apartment, that proves to be quite valuable in terms of resisting stress and its ill effects. Meditation is quite valuable. Taking care of plants, there's a lot of research showing that people's contact with nature is extremely influential in terms of their well-being, both mental health and physical health. So the more contact we can have with indoor nature as well as outside nature, the better off we seem to be. And psychologically, how we frame what's going on in terms of our sense of perspective. We may feel extremely isolated and confined and sad about all those things. And then we think of people who are homeless or living in low-income neighborhoods where they're essential workers. They don't have the luxury of sheltering in place. They've got to be out there day in, day out and being exposed to the virus. So oftentimes when people frame their situations relative to the plight of others, they see that they actually are in a relatively advantageous situation. So that kind of framing of one's emotions is very important. And I'd say also keeping certain projects and hobbies going to the extent that one enjoys music or art or photography or anything like that, knitting, that's an important resource, a coping resource that we have at hand. There are other things, of course, we can do at a personal behavioral level in terms of if we do go out at all, and maybe we get together with some friends in a park area and have an outside picnic. Everyone has their masks on, using hand sanitizer. They're socially distant, but at least they're getting together in an in-person way, a spatially proximal way. But we can make sure to enact those preventive health behaviors. I think that's really important. I think in the early phases of this pandemic, people have gotten so much inconsistent information about what's good to do, what isn't good, what do you need face coverings, do you not need them? Let's open up the economy and get things going, and all these, mixed messages from Dr. Fauci to President Trump. People have been very confused, and I think that's one of the reasons we find ourselves back in another surge in so many states around the country. So we have to be, consumers of good, accurate information and try to put into our own behavioral repertoire, things that are going to protect us. And we also have to be careful about how much media we consume, whether that's social media, cable TV. Too much excessive consumption of bad news is going to have a depressing effect on people. And it's not that we can tune that out completely and ignore what's going on. We have to stay vigilant. Many of us become involved in political activism of various kinds. But just taking in that news in a constant way can be extremely stressful and dispiriting and lead to health problems. And there's a fair amount of research on that. And one of my colleagues at UCI, Roxanne Silver, has done research on vicarious exposure to stressors. Even watching planes during 9/11 going to those buildings, not being in New York, but seeing that on TV, had long-standing negative impacts on people's stress reactions. So, we have to be careful about how much of that news we're consuming on a daily basis, and trying to put it in perspective with other more positive stimuli that we have in our lives and in our environments. There are things in society, as I was saying earlier, that are a bit beyond our control. We can certainly be active to try to work to protect the environment and join various causes to reduce inequality and to encourage people to get out the vote. But there's only so much we can do to stem the political chaos and polarization in the country right now. And so I think we have to keep that in perspective. There are things we can control. There's things that we can't control so well. And we have to be realistic about, what's really in our ability to not only monitor, but also change. So those are some initial thoughts, Joel. And I know I've been talking a while, so I want to get your reactions and other questions that you might have.
I think that's very helpful. You've given us an overview and good points to ponder. One thing that strikes me about the pandemic, unlike some other stressors in our lives, is the uncertainty. We just don't know how long it's going to last. We don't know how it's going to play out. And I wonder if you could speak to the nature and effects of uncertainty and how we live our lives when planning and coping become very difficult.
Yeah, that's a really challenging question, and challenging for us personally to deal with, because we have a really indeterminate amount of time that we're looking at in terms of this pandemic. We don't know if a vaccine is coming, if it'll be effective, how long this lockdown will be required, face masks. What's some research in psychology has shown or suggested is that people who are able to maintain a longer time perspective, in other words, plan out and anticipate good things in the future, and maintain a kind of sense of coherence about their lives, so that even with bad things happening, there's some kind of sense of purpose or feeling of what we're working toward during this very indeterminate period of stress. So clearly time perspective and trying to maintain that sense of purpose or coherence is extremely valuable. There's a researcher in psychology named Aaron Antonovsky, and he did a really interesting study of concentration camp survivors who emigrated from Germany to Israel. And he studied groups of these survivors once they came to Israel. And some of them set up new lives. They got married, they had kids, they lived for many years once they moved to Israel. Others got sick very early on. They had continuing post-traumatic stress disorder. And he found that when he looked at their scores on his sense of coherence scale, the people who had a higher sense of coherence about their life purpose and how the bad things that had happened to them sort of fit into a broader picture or story, those people were better able to cope. They were better able to survive and thrive. But the people who lacked that sense of coherence and who stayed focused on sort of the most immediate negative experiences they had didn't fare as well. So that's not a surefire kind of answer to how we deal with this lack of certainty about how long this will go on. But it does suggest that if we can find resources in our life and points of interest or commitment that we have, if we can highlight those commitments, keep those in mind, and keep a sense of forward progress, even though oftentimes in history it seems like we're stepping backwards rather than going forward. But if we're able to see to believe in some kind of sense of progress and purpose, both in our personal lives and also in society generally, I think we're better able to cope.
I was wondering, does it help to think of how things could be worse in comparison to how they are now? There is a YouTube video that I've seen talking about what would your life have been like if you were born in 1900 and
yes,
experienced the Spanish flu and World War I and World War II and the Great Depression and so on. Does that perspective help, or is it just irrelevant?
I think it does help. I think there have been some recent studies suggesting that older people that have been through those earlier traumatic events of the Depression and World War II and 9/11, they have more of a sense of perspective. They can frame what's happening now to them in the country within this broader sweep of history. And they've seen themselves get through these difficult times. I have relatives who went through World War II and they went through near-death experiences, and they were traumatized when they came home. But they somehow managed to make sense of it all and to move on. And if they couldn't make sense of it all, at least to say, okay, that happened, now I'm going to construct something better. But I think sometimes going through a series of those events inoculates us in a sense, or at least it gives us some confidence that we can cope with things because we've done it in the past. So we're not going to just collapse and give in to this. And I think younger folks today are according to some research, are having more difficulties because in an older population, you have more of that sense of perspective. You can frame things in a longer time span. Whereas younger people, when they see what's going on with the political chaos and the pandemic and the foreboding challenges of climate change, they're very disheartened about what the future holds for them. How are they going to start a family? How are they going to get through school? You can't even go to classes now. Everything is on Zoom. I have a son in graduate school. All the classes now have shifted online. So, it's a very challenging time. It's quite a unique period. It's not as if the world hasn't gone through terrible times in the past. But this pandemic is pretty unique in terms of the number of billions of people in the world that have been locked down at various times and the lack of certainty we all have about when this will improve. And I think another big uncertainty is the political tensions in the world. I mean, if we had global cooperation and we had countries pulling together to find the vaccine and not trying to hack each other's databases and steal information or whatever is happening. If there wasn't all that competition, you know, we're going to get the vaccine first, and we're going to buy up all the supplies, and it's only going to go to the U.S. and nobody else. You know, we need a more collaborative kind of spirit, I think, and it's hard these days because the world is in such a state that we have all these international tensions and conflicts, and that's something we really have to strive to improve in the future.
I'd like to follow up on that. I'm going to ask you if you can elaborate a little bit about the role of national leadership, the effect of the politicalization of the pandemic, and also what we can do to foster people having a global rather than a individualistic view of what's going on. I think in World War II, the British were able to withstand a very traumatic experience at the beginning of that war because their leadership was very strong and didn't sugarcoat what was happening,
Mm-hmm.
but did pull the people together so that morale was strong. And to the same extent, I think when FDR was speaking about our role in World War II, and contrast that, if you would, with what's happening today, and also how we can get people to appreciate that we need to think beyond our own immediate circumstances in understanding what's going on.
Well, I think your point about leadership is crucial. We've seen some countries that have dealt with this pandemic extremely effectively. You think of the leader of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, and they took immediate measures to, close borders, to get people to take preventive actions, and they've reduced the number of cases almost down to zero, I think. And there have been of course, that's a smaller country than the U.S. It's less diverse. It's got clearer, it's an island country. But I think the problem, and one of the problems we have in our country is the very discordant and contradictory messages we get from different authorities. So, Dr. Fauci and a lot of epidemiologists are saying we have to do one thing. You've got the president saying, no, we need to open our schools no matter what. And, is not so concerned about getting a plan for, how that would work in terms of protective measures. So one of the things I'm concerned about in our society is that there's a real challenge or distrust among some segments of the population of science, of evidence, of truth. And, certain things that shouldn't be negotiable suddenly become politically negotiable, like whether face coverings really do prevent or reduce transmission of the virus. And there's pretty clear evidence that they do, but a lot of people, I don't know how many people, but some people would argue that, no, they have no effect at all. We don't have to wear face masks. Besides, it's blocking our oxygen. It's hurting me. When I put that face mask on, I don't want to wear it. It's an infringement on my liberty. Well, we have seatbelt laws. We have non-smoking laws in public places. We have a lot of things that we've adapted to because we know they're good for the public welfare. And, fighting this pandemic is part of that collective effort, to try to improve the overall well-being of the country, the population as a whole. So when people come along and say that there's no scientific evidence for that, we don't have to do it, then that's very debilitating. People take their cue from the leaders and they assume they don't have to do those things. We see that with the labeling of climate change as a hoax. And there's extremely clear evidence that human-caused climate change has accelerated over the last couple hundred years. And we have higher levels of carbon emissions than we ever have. And the implications of all of that are quite dire. We need to be taking preventive steps right now, or at least ameliorative steps to deal with that. But yet we're getting mixed messages about whether it's even important. So I do think that cacophony of stridently divergent messaging is very stressful for people. When people are pulling together as a society and they're kind of on the same page, you see a much more effective collective coping than in countries that are so overly individualized and politicized that that kind of common effort doesn't happen.
I was wondering, do you have any perspective on why there is this element that I think runs historically through this country of distrust of science and distrust of experts, and what that does for the people who have that distrust, and how it affects the rest of us?
Well, it seems like the distrust of science, scientists, so-called elites has become a kind of cultural identity, and we have ideology driving people's behavior, at least some segments of the population, more so than evidence. And so if a vaccine comes out that's effective for preventing or ameliorating COVID, a large swath of people are going to say, I don't want that vaccine because it's going to cause, autism, or it's going to cause some other terrible problem. And so there's a kind of ideological basis that cuts through our politics. And I'm not sure why the U.S. has become sort of the poster child for that polarization in the world. We're not the only polarized country, but we are a very diverse group, and the rural-urban divide is part of it. But it's a big problem. When the NIH developed the human papilloma virus vaccine to prevent cervical cancer, the virology science was excellent. The vaccine is very effective. It prevents cervical cancer. But when the vaccine was rolled out to the public, people didn't adopt it. And one of the reasons is that there were all kinds of social attitudes and mores and beliefs about vaccines causing autism, or the HPV vaccine causing children to become more promiscuous because now they could, engage in sexual behavior more freely, hurting family values. So there are all kinds of social ecological, I would say, barriers to adopting that very good intervention. And, that has hurt a lot of people in the country that didn't adopt it and have had higher rates of cervical cancer. So the same thing can apply to the COVID vaccine if and when that rolls out. So I'm not sure the best way to get the population on the same page, but I do think strong leadership that pays attention to science, that tries to administer the country for all of the voters, not just people that vote for them, are critical ingredients of our getting back on track to a more evidence-based society.
Yeah, I remember there was a dispute about fluoride when it was first introduced into the water supplies, and how some people saw it as a communist plot even. What can we do to have people appreciate that we're all in this together worldwide, having more of a global perspective, to understand that in the case of the virus, it doesn't respect any borders, rather than me first, or only my personal desires and feelings need to be accounted for and catered to.
Well, there's certain things we can do as individuals to try to be kind, to try to reach out to people that are different from us or have less than we do, have experienced higher rates of racial prejudice or any religious prejudice, whatever. So there's certain things in our control in our personal domain, but in the broader societal and cross-lateral, multilateral scene where you have, international politics, it's going to require enlightened leaders who see the value of collaboration. The human species has evolved in some very impressive ways over the years, but it seems that our technological capacities, our ability to pursue solutions to solve certain problems, technological solutions, for example. The internet's a great example. Has outstripped our moral understandings or our collaborative capacity. So you have an internet now that is not only a great boon because people can stay in touch virtually with each other and send documents to each other and email. It's a wonderful convenience, but at the same time, it's propagating hate, it's propagating false information. People can hack electrical grids using the internet, digital technologies. And I talk about this in my book, Social Ecology in the Digital Age, how the cybersphere, all of these digital technologies that have evolved since the 1980s are now overlaid on our natural environment, our social, cultural environment, our built environment, our cars, our homes. And now you have the cybersphere, which is interpenetrated with all that. And it's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's a great benefit and resource. On the other hand, it's a technology that's being put to very poor ends, bad purposes by some folks. And so we need leaders that can help regulate some of that, get some control over processes that are kind of running amok. And that includes collaboration between countries. I know teaching in the university, how much pressure there is now on students born outside the US. A lot of foreign-born students don't want to come to the US for university education anymore. For so many years, our universities were regarded as the very best in the world, and maybe they still are, but they're losing ground because we've put out a message to the world that we don't want you in this country. If you're an immigrant, if you're not from the US, you don't speak English, we don't want you. And that's causing a lot of students who are very bright, can bring a lot of resource to this country, to stay home and not come to the US. 40% of our biomedical workforce is foreign born, and something like 20% of our doctors, working in hospitals to treat COVID patients. And yet we have these incredible anti-immigration laws and visa restrictions where doctors who want to come over from another country to help us deal with this crisis can't come here because of these laws. So we're shooting ourselves in the foot, by being so exclusionary and so reactionary, I would say. So I think, and it's not just our country. I think leaders around the world, we have to be either electing or finding better leadership, people that appreciate the value and the critical importance of collaboration, because the human species is not going to survive just by going to war every 10, 15, 20 years. And now we have the potential for both intentional and unintentional nuclear war, which could wipe out the species. So, these are huge existential problems. And we need to close that gap between our technological know-how and skills and our moral and collaborative capacity.
In the current political climate, the administration is using the threat of socialism as a key point for why you should vote for them to keep this back. It seems to me the word is a Rorschach that you can project whatever meaning onto you want. Can you speak to what that kind of an appeal means and what it does to people? What do people hear when they hear socialism, if you can? Yeah. And what can we say about it? It occurs to me that if you believe in public schools, police forces, libraries, fire departments, public hospitals, national parks, in a sense, those are socialistic entities. But yeah, that's not what people who are opposed to it think about, and they project something very, very horrible onto that word. But I'll let you speak to it, if you would.
Yeah, I think the term has become very politicized, and among the people that sling it as an epithet, as a negative label, They see it as taking away liberty, as encroaching on one's individual freedom. And from my perspective, as you were saying, a lot of our public resources are socialistic, they're collective. And that, to me, is one of the key purposes of government, is to support those collective common resources. So we have a viable public health system and healthcare system. And, we have a good public education system. And I think for ideological reasons, there's been such a retrenchment from that, and a kind of derogation of anything that might be public. Career employees in the national government are seen as the deep state, as if they're somehow antithetical to our well-being. And yet, without career employees, people who are committed to public service, you don't have a very stable and effective government at all. I think one of the things that severe stressors do to people, and this COVID pandemic is a severe stressor. It's very unique, and for all the reasons we've said, the fact that its duration is uncertain, its outcome already has been horrible in terms of deaths and disability. It's a terrible thing we're going through, combined with the other societal upheavals we're going through, from the polarization, racism, worries about war, climate change. But one of the things that these kind of stressful periods do is they sometimes cause a restructuring. What this COVID epidemic has done is it has shown a very bright light on our healthcare system and all of its problems. The fact that we are understaffed, the fact that we don't always have enough protective personal equipment, the fact that there are health disparities and inequities in our healthcare access, the fact that so many people lack health insurance. So whereas maybe 2 or 3 years ago, someone would look at Bernie Sanders and say, oh, he's a socialist, he's too extreme, he's too radical. There's a lot of people out there, and I would dare say maybe some supporters of on the Republican side, that see the need now for some overhauling and some reinvestment in our public health system and our healthcare delivery system, because we've taken it for granted in some ways for too long. And when you have a situation like COVID that's pressing us up against our limits, where some medical personnel are committing suicide, they are so stressed out from what they're seeing, they can't cope. And we can talk about all the resources people can do to meditate and exercise and try to get a sense of purpose in their lives. But, sometimes it becomes overwhelming. And that's what we're seeing in these medical centers that are overwhelmed by COVID. And I think what this is doing to the public at large, just as the killing of George Floyd by a policeman, putting his knee on his neck for close to 9 minutes, that video has encapsulated, centuries of problems in our country around racial inequality. And so that has galvanized and catalyzed this whole new movement. A few years ago, Black Lives Matter was seen as fringe. Now it's much more central to probably the majority opinion in the country supporting it. So, the American system is interesting because it's somewhat elastic. It's like a pendulum. It's gone from one extreme to the other often, extremely conservative, extremely negative. In some ways, our current administration is a reaction to the Obama presidency. And I'm sure there's going to be reaction to the current administration back in some other direction. So my hope is that just as the Depression and World War I caused a lot of positive changes in legislation and in government effectiveness in the US, I'm hoping that somehow we come out of these current stressful periods with a renewed commitment to reinvesting in the public sphere. Because if we don't have that, then we're all sort of islands, trying to make it on our own, and that doesn't work very well. Everything that I know about, stress and coping, from the psychological literature to the sociological literature, the public health literature, depends heavily on people reaching out to each other, taking care of each other. And when people aren't willing to do that, and you have a totally selfish society, it's a recipe for ruin.
To follow up on that, I'm going to ask you an unfair question. You're a scientist, And I know you want to always speak from what the data say, but I'm going to ask you what you think the nation is going to be like when we have this pandemic pretty much under control. I know it'll never go away entirely, but do you have any thoughts on that? And I do apologize for asking you to forecast the future.
Well, yeah, it's very hard to forecast the future. Things are changing so fast. You know, you could say, well, you know, one of the things this pandemic is going to do is it's going to make us more aware of ways we can sort of economize on the resources we expend for travel and for in-person meetings. And somehow, you know, we'll have less impact on carbon emissions if we're not flying as many places and driving as far. I can count the times on a few fingers that I've put gas in my car since March. I think it's maybe once, which is kind of strange. But there have been studies showing that the carbon emissions worldwide have gone down when people were in lockdown, which is not to say that that's the end of the climate change problem, because those are starting to come right back up now as economies open, and we have a lot of CO2 in the atmosphere already, which is going to cause climate change for decades to come. So it's not as if that's an easy problem to fix. But it has shown us, you know, what a perfectly clear Los Angeles looks like when you have so few cars on the freeway. The skies are crystal blue, the air is clear. So it has sensitized people to kind of their relationship with the environment. Hopefully, as I was saying, it's going to redouble our commitment to investing in the public sphere and in social resources, whether you want to call them socialistic resources or collective resources. But we need to build that back if we're going to have a good public education system and healthcare system. Now, whether we're going to get there, I don't know. The coming months are going to be extremely chaotic as you have an administration wanting to stay in power. You have evidence that there are other forces around the world trying to interfere with that election, prevent balloting, mail-in balloting, and all kinds of things. So we've never come up against this before. But I'm trying to stay hopeful that, you know, we're on a recovery trajectory rather than going in the opposite direction, that somehow we're going to take these hard times and make something constructive out of them going forward. That's my hope.
Well, I hope you're right. I want to thank you very much. We've been speaking to Dr. Daniel Stokels from the University of California at Irvine, from the School of Social Ecology and School of Public Health, an emeritus professor now, still active. We very much appreciate what you've done for us today. I'm very pleased with this conversation, and I think that our members will find it very interesting and compelling. Thank you again for spending that time with us.
And I want to thank you, Joel, for talking with me today, and also the Concerned Citizens Group. I have fond feelings for Laguna Woods. My mom lived there for many years on Bahia Blanca, and it's a wonderful community. So if I could be of help in any other way as a resource, please reach out to me.
Thank you. We may very well do that. Thank you once again.